And the second paper is prepared by Aleksandar Kontić and Miloš Zatkalik, and will be presented by Miloš Zatkalik. The title is Tunes of Today from the Island of the Day Before.
Well, thank you. Well, I believe as
Do I check this one?
now you'll hear something not only seemingly totally unrelated to my distinguished predecessor, but also seemingly not very related to the topic of this conference and even to music at all. Because not only that I will begin this presentation with some rudiments of Freudian psychoanalysis. These rudiments, rather than being a mere introduction, will occupy a large portion of the paper, even at the expense of purely musical considerations. I think I'll just have to
Yes, sorry, I'm
put One of the premises of psychoanalytic thinking is the understanding that the Lustprinzip, obtaining of pleasure while avoiding unpleasure, is the basic motive of any psychic functioning, and that in the beginning of psychological life, the id as the representative of this principle is the predominant element of psychic structure. It seeks fulfillment of wishes regardless of reality. Although a rudimentary ego is also present, it is too weak to engage in the significant interplay with its mighty counterpart, the id. The pleasure at this initial developmental phase will be obtained by the discharge of tension, achieved, if possible, without any delay, or, in other words, without prolonging the state of tension. This, however, changes in the course of development, as two psychic instances, namely the ego and superego, enter inevitably into the play. For the purpose of our presentation, we need to investigate the destiny of the impulse to discharge and the pleasure that follows it, leaving aside for the time being the representation of the object that promises satisfaction. The tension that seeks discharge may have a threefold destiny. A. The impulse is renounced, and the further rise of the amount of tension is suppressed and blocked. B. The impulse is turned back to its original source, that is, to the subject. C. The discharge is postponed or withheld until the circumstances permit its discharge and pleasure is gained. A brief explanation is due of how the powerful id impulse can traverse the paths we have just described. In the option A, it is the task of the superego to inhibit, in certain situations, the direct gratification of pleasurable discharge. This inhibition can occur for various reasons. The most common one is that the instant gratification of the impulse, particularly when such an impulse is aggressive, may be dangerous for the person, not only because of the possible retaliation on the part of the attacked object, but also because of the feeling of guilt that may arise, the product of early education and development. The task of the ego in this case is to alarm that the instant satisfaction may lead not to pleasure, but to yet greater unpleasure. One of the possible outcomes of such inhibition is the aggression that is now turned back towards the subject, and this leads us to the option B, turning back upon itself. We do not, at least for now, see how this could be achieved, indeed how we could even recognize such a situation in a piece of music. For the purpose of our presentation, of pivotal interest is therefore the option C, the delay of the impulse to discharge. In order to elucidate this, We will briefly summarize certain points we have made in our previous collaborative work. I cannot dwell on this now, but I would only like to point out that we have repeatedly emphasized isomorphism between musical structures and processes and the earliest mental states. We can briefly run through a few of the examples we have adduced to demonstrate music's extraordinary predilection for condensation, whether in polyphonic blendings of many individual lines, or in seamlessly welding together musical themes. We have even identified situations in which several organizational principles, musical languages as we sometimes call them, are conflated in a single passage of music. At the same time, we have shown how music can be prone to fragmentation. Musical themes or harmonic progressions are fragmented. What is this? Okay. And even the very tissue of music fragments in pointillistic textures, such as associated with Anton Webern, for instance. In enharmonic modulation, two contradictory tendencies are contained within a single event, amounting to simultaneous opposites in defiance of formal logic. Fragmentation, condensation, turning into the opposite, and more. These are characteristics of the earliest mental structures ruled by unconscious so-called primary processes. Further along these lines of thinking, we can account for certain typical procedures associated especially with classical form, including its outgrowth in the 20th century and up to now. A musical event, a theme or any comparable structure is stated and at a certain point can be developed, accompanied by a rising of the feeling of tension. Now, we don't mean to overgeneralize or to be prescriptive, but it is safe to say that the last thing we would expect in such a situation is that the process would be abruptly inhibited and the event, the theme or whatever, definitely abandoned. The situation that would correspond to the item E on our list, item A on our list. This can be subsumed under a general rule postulated by Boris Safiev, whereby the natural law governing musical motion is that each elision is filled up or balanced after a while. The pattern leap filling in, skачок and zapełnienie in Russian, ubiquitous in music. The tension will be released eventually. For this paper, it is of utmost importance is that this after a while part of the statement, that's very important. This while can be quite a long while, but definitely not always immediately. And generally, the music operates on the assumption that tensions are not immediately discharged. Assuming this isomorphism between music and the earliest infantile mental organization, it would follow that in the medium of music, no impulses are aroused that entail conflict with the superego. This does not preclude the possibility that certain occurrences in music can be taken to evoke interplay between ego, id, and superego, but considered from the vantage of the listener's or the performer's experience, we could hardly say that a given motive is immoral or that a certain passage ought to be played with shame. Both these notions, immorality and shame, are of course basing contents of the superego. We can indicate therefore a specific benefit for music arising from a largely neglected source. It is free from conflicts between id and superego. We may say benefit, although we can, I mean, with a Freemason Settembrini from Thomas Mann Sauberberg, we can accuse music of being politically suspect and morally dubious, or even insinuate that music can play a part in a murder, as in Tolstoy's Kreutzer Sonata. As the situations A and B are virtually irrelevant for music, we can examine the situation labeled as C, in which a path to the id impulses is open. The unfolding of a musical event entails a certain amount of tensions that from the very beginning seek discharge. To refer again to our previous work, we have described how the theme object is transformed in the same way in which the psychoanalytic primary processes are described. However, if this be so, a question arises: why music does not present the simplest imprint of the most archaic path, the model of an immediate discharge, which will secure the shortest way of obtaining pleasure? The answer is provided by a number of psychoanalytic authors, Jacobs, Menninger, and so on, who have long since emphasized stimulation without discharge, seeking for excitation as a fundamental psychic force. As William Needles says, I would submit that there are innumerable situations in life in which a striving for stimulation without concomitant discharge is discernible, and that the seeking for excitation is a fundamental property of the psychic apparatus alongside the tendency in different circumstances to minimize excitation. This implies, and for our purpose it is crucial, that the striving for the object promises satisfaction as important as actually gaining it. Here is this quotation from Umberto Eco, which somehow was very inspirational for this paper. That's from Isola del giorno prima, or the island of the day before. And that presents this sort of situation very vividly. How does this work in music? Let us take the object in music, any musical event that fulfills the function of a theme or something of that nature. This event, once stated, and possibly repeated, is subsequently very likely to be fragmented, disintegrated, or it will be replaced by a contrasting one. Ostensibly, the object is lost, temporarily at least. Psychoanalysis teaches us that from the vantage of archaic mental functioning, the loss of the object, or its permanent and unrepairable destruction, is intolerable. Such a situation is famously described by Freud in his study Beyond the Pleasure Principle. A 3-year-old boy was dealing with the trauma of separation from his mother by deliberately hiding his toys in order to find them. The Fort Da game, as is known in psychoanalytic literature. It led Freud to his equally famous statement that the finding of an object is in fact a refinding of it. Refinding, or finding again, implies the prolongation of striving for the object, meaning also the prolongation of tension. Our psychoanalytic understanding offers a possibly surprising explanation. In music, and especially in music, the loss of the object, in other words, the disappearance of the event that has once been stated, is illusory. By prolongation, the identity and presence of the object is constantly maintained. We owe this precisely to the ability of musical events to transform according to the laws of primary processes, which sometimes implies huge distortions. Think of another instance in which these primary transformations are observable, namely dreams. Think on the one hand of all weird shapes that familiar objects assume in dreams, and on the other of the similarity between the way in which they are transformed and musical structures and processes. Again, I cannot go into details. In briefest possible terms, the object, the musical object, may be fragmented, but for the id, the part of the object is the object itself. Or it can undergo a striking level of condensation, blend with numerous other events, and still the constancy is maintained at deeper mental strata. We have already indicated such transformations as being typical of primary processes. It is here that the connection with this conference's topic emerges. The sound object is not always literally present. Objectively speaking, it may not be sounding. Yet, at a certain level, we can hear it vicariously through primary process transformations. We believe that this psychoanalytic explanation taps into the music theoretical concept of prolongation, both in the everyday usage and in its more technical, chiefly Schenkerian sense. Regarding this latter sense, a Schenkerian graph often bears little semblance with the actual composition it purports to represent. But if you accept this line of analysis, the integrity of the structure is unquestionable. We may add here that the prolongation of id impulses is a conditio sine qua non, the education of the immature psyche. And as the early psychic development progresses, the passage of time between the temporary object loss and the action of finding it is more and more prolonged. More than that, it was arguably also the cornerstone of human civilization, as our echo quotation suggests. We are, however, ready to make an even stronger statement regarding music. The prolongation we are discussing is not only possible, it is necessary. It may well be condition for obtaining pleasure from music. Let us be reminded of the losing-regaining game we mentioned, the Fort Da game, with its ingrained and induced tensions that are to be mastered, demanding that the resolution of these tensions is prolonged. We can put it this way. Anticipation is a crucial part of the listening experience. It is accordingly necessary for the object, in this case a musical event, not only to be repeated, but to temporarily disappear, thereby creating expectation of its reappearance. And the tension thus produced is released by regaining the event. Yet the quality of experience that something is prolonged is grounded on the fact that this something is omnipresent. This sounds contradictory, but we need to emphasize that we are dealing not with one, but two areas of experience. One that belongs to the ego, and it says that something disappeared and is about to reappear. At the same time, from the point of view of the id, the object is omnipresent, for the primary process transformations are the object itself. The psychic movement toward searching for the lost object and the resulting release of tension is only possible if the lost object exists in the listener's unconscious mind. We regard this situation as interplay between the id and ego. Transformations appear as such for the ego, and insofar as the logic of primary processes applies, the id experiences them as the same, as identity. Thus, while the ability to audiate is a necessary practical tool for composing, and it exists on the conscious level, it also transpires that it is rooted in the mental structures of both the creator and the listener down to the deepest strata. There are several points that merit further discussion. The occurrence of a wish implies the anticipation of the wish-fulfilling object. This requires the existence of the mental creation of the object, which is tantamount to hallucination, the state we usually associate with pathology. Yet we integrate such an experience not only in the creation and reception of music, but even into theoretical models of music, however rational and subject to logic they are required to be. Furthermore, such a mental creation in itself does not produce the fulfillment and the discharge of tension. In order for that to happen, the ego must be activated to search for the object in reality. So, in real life, the act of thinking is interpolated between the id and the immediate satisfaction. This is what we meant by emphasizing the civilizational aspect. It is true that thinking, a rational attitude, can be part of any human experience, music included. Music, however, is capable of prolonging the path to the object precisely in a non-thinking mode. Such immediacy of experience reveals the mentally archaic origin and consequently its involvement with unconscious processes. It is obvious that within the present framework we can merely scratch the surface of these questions. In the already quoted work by Umberto Eco, the protagonist is stranded on the date line between the past and present, as it were, and the future for that matter, since his love can be attainable only in future, if at all. The past is in a way solidified, materialized in the island he observes, but its pastness remains illusory since it can be experienced only in the present. The categories of today and tomorrow, the past and present and future, dissolve. So do the boundaries between the real and imaginary, mental and material. The composer, and along with him the performer and listener, is stranded in a similar way, prolonging the present in order to defer the future, but the present is a rematerialization of the past. The past, meaning the past phases of the composition itself, or the past compositions. But that past is somehow always inaudibly present in our minds.
Well, time for questions or comments. Okay, if you, yes, please.
Thank you for your presentation. I was wondering, apparently I don't speak loud enough. I was wondering, when you're talking about fulfillment, for me I relate that to memory in music. Does it come into play in your, because also in Shankirian thing, prolongation is it builds on your memory, how much you think, and the anticipation and expectation builds on what you retain from what happening. So I was wondering if the concept of memory relates to what you were saying.
Certainly, memory is precondition of anything, including listening to music or creating music or everything. I'm not particularly concerned with focusing on the way the memory works, but basically it is important that memory can mean all kinds of different things. We have many different types of memories. For the present purpose, for this paper, it is very important to have this various level unconscious memories in which musical past sounds and where continuity is maintained, and in which we even not always consciously hear, in a sense, make it present, even though we are not necessarily always conscious of that while composing or while listening. But it is there, somehow inaudibly present.
Anyone else? More questions? Yes, please.
Hi, thank you so much. It was really interesting. I just wanted to ask about what you thought about the application of Freudianism to music outside of Freud's particular moment, and also perhaps the relationship between Freud and music itself. If you accept Freud as being a development of Schopenhauer, and Schopenhauer being very influenced by a specific type of music, so that like a specific type of developmental and linear goal-oriented music.
As for Freud's relationships to music, that's very interesting and very indicative. There is his statement, he complained that he couldn't really obtain much pleasure from music. He explains that some rationalistic turn of my mind somehow prevents me to enjoy fully something which I cannot explain, which actually is a very, very strong support for this idea of strongly unconscious relation to music. Now, of course, many things, the standing grievance against Freud is that what he says applies to Viennese middle class at the fin de siècle and so I wouldn't quite agree with that. Are we allowed to say something universally human? I would be perhaps somewhat cautious in saying that. But I think that his discoveries, and I'm making a point of going back to him, I think that he anticipated many things that even today neurosciences give some support to his idea. So I believe it's much wider than let's say, Vienna at the turn of the century. Of course, I may be wrong, of course, but somehow my approach is based on that idea that it's applicable much, much beyond this particular time and space.
More questions? Okay, I think we have to continue. Thank you once again.